being recorded, so if you need to leave partway through, just know that we're going to record the whole thing for you, and it'll be available on YouTube the day afterwards. I'll send a link out to that. For those of you that are new to GoToWebinar, what I suggest is that you take the question area and pop that out. You'll see a little drop down where you can expand the questions, and then hit that little box with the arrow in it to pop it out, and then collapse the rest of the control panel down. That way you can see everything that we're doing on the screen, and if you have Tableau, you can follow along as well. Today we are going to be using Tableau Desktop. Tableau just came out with a new version, 10.4. I'm still using 10.3, Tableau Server 10.3 as well, and then a GIFs data source that we have created that's based on Razor's Edge query, but the concepts that we're doing can apply to really any GIF data, regardless of what CRM system you are using. I have a lot of material to cover today, so just an overview of what we're going to be doing is that I'm going to talk about data prep, and really the importance of data prep, especially for something like this, where you're going to be maybe doing a more in-depth analysis. Actually, I'm going to create a worksheet that we then use as a data source. I'll explain why and how that works. And then we're going to jump in and start analyzing and build some worksheets. This webinar, in some ways, it ended up being a follow-up to a webinar I did earlier this week for APRA. And what I originally intended was that I was basically going to do the same webinar for the APRA folks as I was going to do today. However, once I got in and started doing all of this, I realized I kind of bit off more than I could chew. And so I didn't cover all the stuff I wanted to cover in the APRA webinar. So this is kind of part 2 of what I had started in the APRA webinar. So for those of you who had attended that, I'm going to just do a brief overview of what I went over during the APRA webinar a couple of days ago, but we're going to spend most of the time today on the analysis side of things. Okay. And once again, yeah, if you have questions as we're going along here, just go ahead and type them in as you think of them, and I'll try my best to answer as we go. It's, we're just having fun here, so don't worry about if you're interrupting me or anything like that. I usually have, a sidekick along here with me to help me through the webinar, so it's just me flying solo today. So if it takes me a little bit longer to get to your question, don't worry, I will get to it eventually. And with that, let's get in and start building. Okay, so what we're looking at here is I had already opened up Tableau and connected it to our Tableau server, a GIFs data source in there. And this is something that we just have available to our customers that have the Tableau service with us, where we basically build a data source that works like Razor's Edge Query does. So in this GIFs data source here, we happen to be connecting to the sample database that Blackbaud's created. So there's not, the GIF data that's in here is, made up data. In some ways, the numbers won't make sense, but, it's just as an example of what it is that you can do. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at just our straight up look at our data. So we're going to look at over time. So we're going to be looking at segments of time in the columns just by year. And then we're going to look at just all of the data that's in there. Starting with the records ID, we happen to call it the records internal ID, but it's, if you're familiar with Razor's Edge, it's the records ID. So each one of these is associated with an individual constituent. And so basically we see, here's all the records that are in the system, and then the ABC is like, okay, that's a placeholder for what it is that you want to calculate. So the first thing that we want to do is, if we're going to look at donor retention and churn and stuff like that, we want to get a sense of when somebody, when they were a new donor, they gave for the first time, and then if they lapsed, we want to be able to keep track of all these different sort of states that they went through over time. So to start with, we need to create some calculated fields so that we can, sort of start to capture these things. So the first one that we do is, I've already made these in the system here, is this one, isn't it? That's the first gift amount. Is really the first gift date. When's the first time that they gave any money to our organization? And the way to do that in Tableau is to do what's called a level of detail calculation. So we're looking at basically for each gift that a person gave, because a person, presumably could have given multiple gifts, right? So we want to look at, for each one, the minimum gift date, like the first time that they gave. So that's what the first gift date. So this is just a calculated field that allows us to do that. There's another calculated field which is the total gift amount by donor. This is another level of detail calculation. So it's saying for each donor that's in the system, let's sum up all the gifts that they have given us completely over time. Okay, so let's start to add some of these things then to our visual. So we'll go ahead and double click on that, and it adds it to the label field over here. And now we can see, okay, this is what the giving situation looked like for each person. So this first record in here, they first gave $2,000 in 2009, and then, this is a sum of different values that they gave over time. This person gave a lot of money here. We can see the total amount that they gave each year. So the next thing that we want to do is to be able to calculate what I call the donor state. And this is what I spent a lot of time covering during the APRA webinar, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this today. Just know that, we'll send you a copy of this after the webinar, all the calculations. There's going to be a lot of calculations going on. But basically what this does is it's a way to track the state of the donor over time. And, we can see, just kind of starting out here on the first line, if they had never given us any money and they hadn't given us any money the previous year, then they're not a donor. And if that's not true, then you go to the next line. If they had given us money, some money, and we have this other calculated field called date diff, and so basically if that date that they gave us that money is the difference between the first date and the last, or the first date and the current giving date is this year, then this turns out to be 0, then they're a new donor, and so on, different states. They could be a returning donor, and then we have other states as well if they went up in value or up in terms of the donation versus the previous year. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to the visualization here. And you can see by doing that now that it's now capturing, the various states that each of my donors has gone through. So this one was new, and then in 2010 they lapsed, and then if they come back again, we have a different state for them called return or required or whatever, but I'm calling it return. And then they went up in value, up, up, down, up, and then lapsed again. That's just that one donor. So what the purpose of this is here is that I want to start to build out a map of how all my donors behaved over time. And I want to add these to this worksheet so then I can use this worksheet, save it all the results of all of this and use it as a data source to then, you know, look at some of these concepts of retention and churn and stuff like that. There's a couple of other values that I want to throw in here as well. There's another one that we have called consecutive years giving. So basically there's a calculation in Tableau called previous value that if you use that, then it can just sort of increment. So we add the consecutive years giving, then we see, okay, if they're new, that's 1 year giving. Lapsed, back down to 0, they return, okay, it starts over again at 1, and now it increments 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that this is a way then we can start to build out, you know, how many consecutive years that they've been giving. Again, getting more information about the behavior of the donors. And this step is important. You know, I think you need to think about the different kinds of things that you want to capture here in this data prep step. And I'm doing it this way because just logically it makes sense to me to kind of build out, you know, these states and these various things that the donors went through. That's, you know, it's really kind of appending on to the data that we already have in there, and then use this for analysis. Then there's one other crazy thing that I want to throw in here, something that I call donor math. So this is a calculated field that's basically assigning different values depending on whether they went, if they were a return donor, a new donor, up, down, same. It's kind of like that consecutive giving, but I'm, you know, assigning different values, different weights, if you will, based on what they were. So if they're a returning donor, I'm assigning it this weight. A new donor, I'm assigning it this weight, up, down. And the reason I'm doing this in increments of 100 is basically, you know, they can be a, you know, they can go through any one of these states, you know, 99 times, and they won't run into each other. So I can add up, okay, the number of times that they were down across all their giving history, the number of times that they were the same, the number of times that they were up, and just kind of add all these values together. And it's kind of like, you know, with binary math, you know, I can calculate this. So this crazy thing I'm going to add in here as well. And what else might we want to add? I have another value here called Cohort. Cohort is basically the year that they first started giving. So this is just taking that first gift date concept that we used before. So that adds the cohort in there. So I'm almost done with my data prep part right here. The only other thing I want to do is to edit in shelf for this particular thing and add a ZN around this value of the total amount given. And what that does is it basically says if there's a null value, if there's nothing in there for it, just put a 0 in. So that way my data has at least zeros in it for all of those possibilities. Okay, so any questions about the data prep here? I know we kind of breezed through this really quickly, and but the idea again is just that we want to be able to capture this states that the donors went through. One person says, "Hi Glenn, every once in a while someone in the Blackbaud community forums asks about a report for donors who gave X out of Y years. Seems like Tableau could report on this. Similar to consecutive years, correct?" Yeah, you could do that. You could go through and say, maybe, you know, add up consecutive years, or just, yeah, you'd be able to count basically the number of years where the donor state was either new or returned or up, down, or the same. Basically, if it's not lapse and it's not, you add up all of those, and that will tell you the number of years that they gave. Where's the video where you went through all the calculations in detail? That was a webinar I did with AFRA, so I think you have to be an AFRA member to get that. But yeah, I will send these calculations out afterward, and I'm happy to spend time with you to go over it with you if you want to, set up time for me later one-on-one. So, yeah. So Josh, to answer your question, yeah, I think that would be really easy to do in Tableau, especially doing the data prep thing that we're doing here. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is, again, we're doing just data prep at this point, so I want to save this stuff off as its own data source. So I'm going to say select all, and then I'm going to say view data, and there's all my data, and now I can export it, and I can save it as a CSV file. Okay, so enough of that fun. Let's go and start analyzing data now. So I'm going to open up another instance of Tableau and connect to that file I just created right here, prep data. All right. So here's all my data in this new worksheet, and I just need to do some quick tweaking on here. So in Tableau, you have dimensions and measures. It created, some of these are numbers, so it just assumed that it is a measure. We're going to convert some of these to dimensions. And we're going to rename this, just say total given. All right. Just to start out here, just with some first level calculations, if we will, let's just look at, say, the number of donors and do some analysis on that. So the first thing we want to do is calculate how many donors were there this year. So let's create a calculated field. And I have my little cheat sheet here of all my calculations. Again, here's all this stuff that I'll send you guys of all the things that I did in that one. So I'm too lazy to type all this out again. Donor this year. Okay. So if someone was a donor this year, then they had one of these states. They were either down, up, same, new, or return. If they were in any one of those states, then they were a donor this year. Yeah? Okay. I'm going to make another calculated field, and I'll call it donor type. Donor type, it might be too much information to look at all those different possible states. We want to simplify it a little bit. If someone is new, I want to capture that. If someone is a returning or reacquired donor, I want to capture that. Otherwise, they're just sort of a recurring donor. This is also a dimension. And because I made these as numbers, you can do something in Tableau called Alias, where you can say, okay, new, actually want to call that new, not the number 1. So I can say this is new, and if it was a 2, then we'll call them reacquired. Hopefully I spelled reacquired right, and otherwise they're, I don't know, a recurring donor. Okay. So let's take a peek at this. So we're going to look at year that way. We're going to look at the number of donors this year. And then we'll look at donor type as a color. So then this gives us a sense right off the bat of here's our number of donors that we have across all the years, and here's the different types. We see here's the new ones in orange, the reacquired ones are the ones that they had been donors in the past, then they lapsed, then they came back, and then the recurring ones, they were a donor at least the year before. Okay. We'll call this just simply number of donors. Okay. Now let's start to look at a little bit more information. Let's look at the growth rate now. So let's figure out the growth rate. We need to know, we got the donors for this year, but what if, how do we find out the donors in the previous year? They were a donor from the previous year. How can we look at this year's data to tell if they were a donor from the previous year? Well, if they're in a state of down, up, same, or lapsed this year, then they had to have been a donor last year. Right? Does that make sense? They can't be, if they're new or they're returned, then they weren't a donor last year. They had lapsed or they weren't a donor at all. So if they're in any one of these states, down, up, same, or lapsed, then they were a donor last year. Okay, then to get the rate of, so now we're going to calculate the growth rate, and that's just simply the number of donors this year divided by the number of donors last year. It's just the overall rate of growth. Then if you're going to do something that's a growth rate, that's a percentage, you can either do math in the calculated field, which is an extra complication that I don't like to do. I instead just like to change the properties of the value itself and tell it, hey dummy, you are a percentage, and so be a percentage. Okay, so now we're just going to do the same kind of thing. We're going to look at year, look at growth rate. Maybe do this as a line. And then we can, if you take this pill from the rows and then you hold down the control button on your keyboard and then drag it down, it'll make a copy of that pill wherever you drag it to. If I didn't hold down the control and I just drug it down, it would move it. So I did that, just drug it down to the label, so now it's putting the label on. So now we can see this is our growth rate. Of course, when we started out, we had like 1 donor, and then we got to 2 donors, so it went up 100%, and then we got whatever, 10 or 11 donors, so it shot way up in the percentage, and so we're kind of doubling and tripling, and then, again, it's sample data. So, but this is our growth rate. Okay, let's look at churn rate now. How would we calculate the churn rate? Does anyone know how to do churn rate? Make a new worksheet here. What is churn rate? Churn rate is basically like how many donors you lost. So the growth rate is how many more donors you're adding. So the churn rate then is, how many donors you've lost in a given period. So what does it mean to lose a donor? How do we track that? Well, we can say if the donor's lapsed, then they were a lost donor. So we have this other calculated field. Donor lapsed. So lapsed is they were a donor last year and they did not donate the next year. They're lapsed. And so then let's calculate the donor churn rate. Donor churn rate. Again, I'll give you guys all these calculations. So the churn rate is how many were lapsed, how many did we lose versus the overall number of donors that we have this year. That's the churn rate. Churn rate, so I have to do the same thing here with the number format. Make it a percentage. So there's our churn rate. Well, let's take a look at this and see if this makes sense. First of all, I'm going to filter out 2017 because that's kind of throwing the numbers off. The year's not over yet, so we don't want to call them churning. So we'll remove 2017 from there so it doesn't throw our graph off so much. So according to this, looks like we had some churn in 2006, wasn't too bad, it started to go back up again, and then in 2012, we lost a lot. So let's go back to look at our number of donors here and see if that is the case. And yes, that does appear to be the case, where you can see 2012 was way down. So our churn rate was way up. Okay, now that we have some of these basic things in place, now we can get a little bit more sophisticated and look at maybe a particular type of donor, a particular type of retention rate for them. So maybe, one thing that I think is a real important metric for you all, for nonprofits to measure, is first-time donor retention rate. Like those first new donors that come in, what's your retention rate on those? So I think that's a good one to look at next. So before I start building that, does anyone have any questions about this part and what we're doing? Just kind of laying the foundation for looking at some of these rates, retention rates and whatnot. All right, and now I'm going through this kind of fast, but the magic was really in that data prep step to allow us to do these kinds of things here. Okay, so first-time donors. First-time donors. So what's the first thing that we need to do? Well, we need to figure out if they were a first-time donor the previous year, because we want to know what our retention rate is for first-time donors. So we have to know if they were a first-time donor the previous year and then they gave again or didn't give again in year 2. That's really what we're trying to get at here. So the first step is, were they a first-time donor last year? This is where that crazy math I did comes in. So we want to look at the data this year. We don't want to look at last year. We want to look at the data, this year, for year to year, and how can we tell if they were a first-time donor last year or not? And so here's what we do. We say, okay, if their donor state was down and their donor math equals this value, which is basically the 1 at the beginning means they were a first-time donor, and then the 1 at the end means they went down. So when we did that donor math, it would add up to this value. They could have only donated twice to get this value, and it had to have been down and new in order to obtain that value. And the same with this one with same, this one with up, and then if they're lapsed, then they were just a new donor, and so they had this value, and we didn't add on to it this year because they were lapsed. So again, if they were a first-time donor last year, that means that this year they either lapsed, they gave more, they gave the same, or they went down in their next donation. Cool? Makes sense? All right. So that's the first-time donor for the previous year. Now we need to figure out how many of those were retained. First-time donor, yeah, we'll just call it retained. It's basically the same thing that we did over here with first-time donor last year. Oops, I think I got the wrong thing here. First-time donor retained. I got the same formula in there, so that's wrong. So if they were retained, there is no lapsed. So if they were retained, we remove the lapsed part, basically. So if they're a first-time donor, we kept them the second year, then they either gave the same, less, or more, and would have one of these values. Okay? And then we just do the retention rate. First-time donor. Well, I didn't get all my formulas in here, so I'm going to have to type it out. First-time donor retention rate. So that will be the sum of, so Tableau is this cool autocomplete feature. So how many we retained now, divided by the sum of how many we had the previous year. First-time donor retention rates, where are you? And we'll make this a percentage. Blammo. All right, so there's our first-time donor retention rate. Notice the dot is not connected up here because we have a discontinuity in 2004. Basically, we lost everyone. So we had 100% churn and lost everyone that year. So again, sample data. All right, we'll call this one first-time donor retention rate. All right. Now let's maybe start to look at something to do with our retained donors. let's look at how many retained or recurring donors that we had this year. Well, since I've already done the work of these other calculations, oh, I didn't do first-time donor this year yet. Need to make that calculation first. So the number of recurring donors this year will be the number of donors this year minus the first-time donors this year. Gives an error because I forgot to calculate that field. That one's easy though. First-time donor this year. First-time donor this year is basically if the donor state equals new so if their state is new, they're a first-time donor, so that part's easy. And then this other one, that other error went away. All right, so now we want to get, I'm going to do a different kind of chart here. I call this one a lollipop chart. So we're going to get in depth a little bit into the recurring donors and get a little bit of a breakdown in terms of, are they, what are their kind of giving levels associated with these donors? All right, so we're going to do year again up here, and then the recurring donors. So what I did here is I'm going to make what's called a dual axis chart. So I just duplicated this pill, again by holding down the control button and just moving it over. I've made basically 2 copies of it. And then they show up in the marks card over here. The first one's a line, the second one's a line. I'm actually going to change the second one to a circle. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the donor state. Tableau thinks it's an actual geographic value, probably because there's the word state in it. So I'm going to tell it, no, it's not a geographic value. I'm just calling it state. I'm going to drag this over on the second one to the color. And then we're going to filter out some of these because we're only interested in if someone's a recurring donor, then they were up, down, or the same. And then I'm going to take the same thing, the donor state, and put it on this other value over here called path. And path basically just shows like the variations, the range between, one extreme versus the other. And then you can click on one of these pills up here and then say dual axis. And then when you do that, it puts them on top of each other. So what this is telling us is that these are the number of recurring donors each year, but then what state are these donors in? And so we can see year to year, how are donors giving at the same giving level, how many of those we have versus how many are giving at higher giving levels versus the previous year. And the blue ones is how many are giving at lower giving levels versus the previous year. And we'll call this one. Recurring donors by donor state. Okay, let's keep going here. Let's look at now consecutive years of giving and how that affects things. Let's see here. We'll do year again, and consecutive years giving. Maybe look at the average of consecutive years giving. Now the problem is when you do that, you have to, filter out and only look at certain donor states because it's skewing the value. Otherwise, the people that are not giving or they're lapsed. If we're just interested in those that are recurring donors, then it's going to be again down, same or up. Those are going to be our consecutive years giving, right? You could throw in new and return as well, but we're just going to look at the consecutive years instead. So we can see the average now. So if we're looking at the average consecutive years of giving of people who've given, it would be at least 2 years, and how that varies over time. And we can do the same thing that we did on the previous chart and do a lollipop format for this. So we can do a line for that and a circle for that. And then, again, take the donor state. Oh, I didn't want to move it. I want to copy it. But it's going to just move it for some reason because it's being stupid. Okay. I'll drag it down there again, and then to the path on this. We'll call this a dual axis as well. Okay. So again, we're looking at these different donor states again to see, how the average consecutive years of giving changes over time for these different kinds of donors, giving at the same, more or less giving levels. So I'm just kind of, riffing through here. None of this is like supposed to be best practice or, say, hey, you absolutely have to do this. I think first-time donor retention rate, yeah, you definitely want to do that and some of these, but, just kind of giving examples of different things you can try and just, mess around, play with it, just get a sense of kind of what's possible and what you can do. All right, so this one's kind of a mouthful. Average consecutive years giving by donor state. Okay, we'll do one more. So one other thing that would be interesting, I think, to look at is how the percent of money donated varies. And since we're looking at consecutive years of giving, let's do maybe kind of group these a bit. So we'll call this, let's see if I already made a calculated field for it. I'll call it consecutive years giving group. And then we'll just say, okay, if consecutive years giving is greater than, actually, let's say is less than 2. So that could be one group if they're like new or they've given, not less than 2, less than 3, like 1 or 2 years. Then we'll call that one group. Else, if consecutive years giving is greater than 2, and less than 5. Actually, instead of doing aliases, we'll just come out and type what we want it to be then. Consecutive years giving is less than 3, then we'll say 1 to 2 years. And we'll say on this one, 3 to 5 years. Else, less than 6. More than 2, which is 3. Less than 6, which is 5. Otherwise, more than 5. Hopefully I did that right. Consecutive years giving group. Okay. So for this one, we're going to look at year again. And we're going to look at the total amount given. So now we're looking at money. This is how much money was donated. We're going to do this as a percent total. So right now, when I do this, I add a table calculation. It creates the percent total across. So this is like the percent total across all years, but I want to look at per year. So instead, I edit my table calculation. I say instead of going across, go down, which if you don't add anything else to it, makes no sense because it's 100% every year. But that's when we're going to drag down this group now into color and then into the label. Actually, no, we want the percent to be in the label. I hate the colors here. Let's change the colors a little bit. One to 2 years, sure, you can be that. Actually, we'll make you light blue. You're blue, and you're green. Is that green? Whatever, something different. All right, a little less hard on the eyes. So yeah, what does this tell us here? That says, okay, of these different, what percentage of the money that we raised was given by these different consecutive year groups? So basically, you know, fairly new donors or donors that have been with us, you know, 3 to 5 years or more than 5 years, to get a sense of how the money is coming in relative to the donor history with us. So we'll call this one percent donated by consecutive years giving group. Yeah, that's all I had prepared for you today. I know we covered a lot of material, and you know, I'm happy to talk with any of you later if you want to send me an email if some of this is, you know, you want some additional help or clarification on. I'm, you know, more than happy to help out as a resource and give you some tips. But yeah, again, just kind of riffing through some different things, try to give you some ideas of what to do. And we will send out a copy of both the Tableau workbook that I used for this data prep, as well as the data prep spreadsheet and all of the calculations today. So I'm going to hang on for just a bit and see if you guys have any questions. and take those questions. But otherwise, I hope this was helpful, give you some ideas about what to do for analyzing your data, prepping it first. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.